Our Shermans are just iron boxes, but even an iron box can bite. In the mist of Lorraine in September 1944, outmatched American crews turned Arracourt into the tomb of two Panzer brigades. More than 285 Panthers and Panzer IV were crushed, reduced to ashes where Hitler once believed victory would be won. Berlin, early September 1944. In the smoke-filled room of the Chancellery, a map lay spread across the polished wooden table beneath the yellowed light. Small pins in blue, red and black stuck throughout the stretch of French territory, extending all the way to Germany's border. From a distance, it looked like a vast chessboard, but everyone in that room knew this was no game. These were the pieces of a nation's fate. Hitler stood motionless before the map for a long moment. His eyes were bloodshot, his fingers tapping the edge of the table with a nervous jitter. News from the Western Front had made the air even heavier. The Allies had crossed the Moselle River, and Patton, the armoured monster of the American armoured forces, was pressing into Lorraine, advancing rapidly toward the border. Each passing day, the Americans gained tens of miles. "Those American dogs," Hitler muttered, his voice hoarse. "They think they can march straight to the Rhine, and no one will stop them." The generals standing around him kept silent. Only the ticking of a wall clock could be heard. No one dared interrupt while the Führer raged. A staff officer, hands shaking, handed over a stack of reports. "Mein Führer, according to reconnaissance, Patton's forces have crossed the river at multiple points. The 4th Armoured Division is in the lead, supported by artillery and tactical air. They are advancing too fast. We have not yet had time to reinforce our defensive lines." Hitler snatched the papers and slammed them onto the table. "Enough! I do not want to hear excuses. What I want is a counterattack, a punitive blow. If the Russians could halt us at Kursk, why can't we do the same to the Americans?" He turned to General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of Panzer Army Group 5, who had just been summoned from the Eastern Front. Manteuffel stood upright, staring straight ahead, sweat beading on his brow. "Manteuffel!" Hitler barked. "You have faced the Red Army. You know what true battle is. Now I give you the task of stopping the Americans. I want a counterattack into Lorraine, immediately." Manteuffel answered in a firm tone, though he couldn't hide his concern. "Mein Führer, our forces lack fuel, and many newly formed units have not completed training. Panzer Brigades 111 and 113 were only recently created. Most of their crews have never fired in combat. The 11th Panzer Division suffered heavy losses in Normandy. If we attack now, I fear—" Hitler brought his fist down on the table. A cup of coffee toppled and spilled, staining the map with a blotchy smear. "No more ifs. Decisiveness makes victory. Patton must be crushed before he reaches the Rhine. Lorraine will become his grave." For a moment the room seemed to reverberate, only with Hitler's growling. The generals were silent, but everyone understood the facts. The Panzer brigades had been thrown together hastily, crews trained for only a few weeks, short on fuel and lacking motorized reconnaissance. Yet the order had been issued, and the Führer's orders were absolute. Manteuffel bowed his head slightly. "Understood, mein Führer. Panzer Army Group 5 will counterattack, but allow me at least some basic preparations. Lorraine's terrain is full of fog. The element of surprise could be in our favour." Hitler's voice sank, a mad glint flickering in his eyes. "Yes, the fog will be your ally. And the Panthers, Germany's hunting beasts, will crush those paper-box Shermans. I want Patton pushed back. I want the Allies to know Germany will not be subdued." He turned and walked out the door, leaving the room heavy with a sense of doom. The generals exchanged glances, but said nothing. Only Manteuffel inhaled deeply and folded the map, thinking to himself, "Whatever happens, I will have to do it." At Lorraine, a few days later. A gloomy afternoon. The rain had just passed, leaving a thick, sucking mud on the country roads of France. In a hidden assembly area, rows of brand-new Panthers lined up under the trees. A group of young German soldiers sat on the turrets, wiping away raindrops. Their faces were still boyish. Many hadn't yet turned 20. A corporal whispered to his buddy, "This is madness. We've only fired a few practice rounds, and now they're throwing us into the biggest battle since Normandy. Do we even stand a chance of coming back alive?" The other shrugged, eyes staring off into the distance. "Don't ask. We're Panzer. We just move forward." In the field command tent, Manteuffel leaned over the Lorraine map. He knew the truth all too well. Too few men, too little fuel, crews too green. But an order was an order. We must fight, if not for victory, then for honour. At the same time, on the other side of the lines, inside the 4th Armoured Division's bivouac near Nancy, night was closing in. American soldiers gathered around field stoves, listening to the scratchy jazz coming from a radio. In one corner, Colonel Creighton Abrams sat writing a few notes for his report. He was the kind of commander who led from the front, often driving his own Sherman into the thick of a fight. A young sergeant stepped in, saluted smartly. "Sir, intelligence says the Germans are massing tanks to the north. They may be preparing a counterattack." Abrams looked up and smiled. "Well, looks like they finally scraped together enough gas to move. Good. We'll be ready to greet them." The sergeant hesitated. "But, sir, our Shermans can't match the Panthers." "At long range, we don't stand a chance." Abrams closed his notebook and stood, his voice steady and sharp. "Listen, son. A tank is just steel. Victory doesn't come from a longer gun, it comes from the men inside. I've trained you hard, and you've fought non-stop since Normandy. When you climb into a Sherman, remember, skill and spirit beat thick armour any day." Outside, Shermans rumbled to life, their engines thundering in the Lorraine night. Across the line, German Panthers were also cranking up, ready to clash head-on in a brutal storm of steel. In the darkness, both sides knew a reckoning was coming, and Lorraine, land of fog and mud, would soon turn into a furnace. Dawn broke over Lorraine. At the far end of the field, a row of Shermans lay hidden beneath camouflage netting, their hulls crusted with dried mud like fish scales. Tankers woke to the smells of instant coffee, engine oil, and cigarettes. Sergeant Eddie Doyle of Company C, 37th Regiment, yanked the cord to fire up the auxiliary engine and pressed his ear to the steel hull as though listening to the heartbeat of a beast. "Come on, Lucy," he whispered to his Sherman. "Don't give me trouble today." Lucy was named after Eddie's old girlfriend back in Boston, and, like the tank, she had a habit of sulking for no reason. "Hey, Doyle!" Private Kramer shoved his helmet back, a lucky strike dangling from his lips. "Word is, the Krauts are bringing in a whole brigade of fresh Panthers. You ever seen one?" "Yeah," Doyle grimaced, "in their propaganda photos. Those barrels are long enough to pick their teeth with us from 2 clicks away." He patted Lucy's 75mm gun, lowering his voice. "And us? Just a 75 million in a tin box." From the command post came 3 sharp whistle blasts. "Form up! Check formations, check radios. Division staff, General Wood, wants a word." The whole camp stirred. Tankers scrambled down from turrets, mixing with armoured infantry who had just finished breakfast, M41 jackets streaked with mud. They fell into formation in front of a tarp-covered jeep. Major General John S. Wood, lean, bright-eyed, stepped forward in a thin, olive-drab overcoat. He wasn't the kind of general who barked orders from behind a desk. He walked more than he sat, acted more than he spoke. And when he spoke, he kept it short. "Men," Wood began calmly, "you've heard the rumour. A bunch of wildcats are coming our way." A ripple of chuckles ran down the line. In Lorraine, everyone called the Panther a wildcat. Yes, they've got long guns and thick front armour. That's true, but they're short on fuel, short on scouts, short on coordination. We're not. We've fought side by side since summer. We've eaten together, slept in the mud together, fixed engines in the rain. You know what the crew on your flank will do before they say a word. You know where our shells will land before you hear them scream. That's our edge. He paused, sweeping his gaze across the men. When you meet a panther, don't fight at long range. Use the ridges, hedgerows, stone walls. Force them to turn their sides. Fight close. Think of it like hunting a bull. Dodge the horns, drive your spear into the flank. Our artillery will clear the way, and the P-47s will strafe them when the skies are clear. The rest is up to you. Do what we've been doing since 41 a hand went up. General, what if the skies aren't clear? Wood's smile was thin but steady. Then you boys are the sky. Laughter rippled through the ranks, blending into the growing roar of engines across the camp. The speech was short, but it swept away the last of the unease. Inside the staff tent, the map lay spread over a wooden ammo crate. Blue and red ink marks crowded like a mob at a train station. Colonel Creighton Abrams stood with one hand on his hip, tapping a finger on the spot marked Arracourt. His brown eyes carried a strange calm, not the calm of a man oblivious, but of one who had already seen the worst and the best. The recon just reported, the intelligence officer said. Heavy track marks to the north and northwest. They look to be moving in groups, thick fog, no mechanized scouts out front, Abrams nodded. They're operating by the book. When they lack scouting, they stick to the original plan. All the better. Keep them on the margins of the marsh roads. We'll use this rise. He tapped a gently sloping knoll with his pencil. For support and to roll up their left flank. Put the M10s in echelon behind. My Shermans will bait them at close range. Colonel, the artillery lieutenant interjected, we're short on smoke rounds. Then improvise smoke, Abrams replied as if it were nothing. When the first one burns, the ones behind will be blind. He lifted his hat and fastened the chin strap. I want to be at the front with Company C. Tell General Wood I'll swing by his group at noon. Colonel, the runner began, looking out at the milky sky. Do you need an escort? No, if the wildcats want to hunt, let them smell me. It sounded cocky, but everyone in the tent knew Abrams well enough. He always found the enemy's weak point and hit it. On the tank line, Doyle climbed into the gunner's seat and snapped the harness. Kramer slid down into the loader's position and exhaled. How many did you use the last time you knocked a panther out? Don't remember, Doyle said. I only remember I fired while he was traversing the turret. Driver Joe Colorado Hayes thumped the wheel. Remember to pray before you go out, boys. All right, Colorado. Kramer popped open an ammo can and pulled out a heavy AP round that hummed in his hand. I'll pray for the Krauts when they meet this. He brought the shell to his lips and kissed it lightly. Give me a clean flank, Lucy. On the radio, the controller's voice crackled. Company C, check. C1. C1 copies. C2? C2 copies. Abrams broke in on the net. Keep the radio silent unless you contact the enemy. Tree lines and hedgerows are your friends. Don't charge across open fields just to prove you're brave. Courage is living long enough to fire a second time, Doyle thought. He says that every week, and it never gets old. He pulled the sight closer and adjusted the focus. The world through the scope collapsed into muted greys, trees sketched like pencil strokes. Lorraine hides its colours. Sometimes all you get are blacks, whites, and a few oil-dark greys. Left track, warm enough? Hayes asked. About right, Kramer answered. Don't let it slip like last week. I don't want to be running after you in the shell splashes. Hayes smirked. Nobody wants to watch your butt jiggle in an artillery shower." They laughed together. Outside, the mortar crews were moving into position. Mechanized infantry checked magazines and tucked extra smoke grenades into their belts. A line of M10s rumbled by, their angular turrets like banjo cases. The M10 loader threw up a V with 2 fingers at Doyle. Doyle returned the salute, watching until the tank destroyers vanished behind a haystack. By noon, the fog still hung heavy. The field ahead showed blotchy brown streaks, furrows, knolls, stone walls. On the radio, an artillery observer adjusted fire. "Fire for effect. Low by 50. Add 20. Fire." A deep boom answered, muffled like hands clapping in a cave. "Colorado," Doyle said. "Bring me up to that stone fence line. Move, move, stop." The Sherman nosed into cover like a cow seeking shade. Doyle slipped the gun through a gap in the stones. In his earpiece, the scout's voice came, "Tracks, 11 o'clock. Abrams ordered immediately over the net. "Companies, fall back 1 depth from the open. Don't be rash. Let them walk into the trap." There was a sharp intake of breath on the radio, then silence. Doyle gripped the handhold. Giving ground. That was their tradecraft. Let the hunter pass the cave's mouth and expose his flank to the waiting ambush. A minute, 2 minutes. Sweat soaked Doyle's gloves. The quiet made his heartbeat sound like hammer blows on an empty barrel. Then the ground trembled faintly. "Tracks," Hayes whispered, though he knew whispering wouldn't stop the earth from shaking. Through the sight, Doyle saw it, the flat, sloping turret face, the mean European wildcat countenance. Then a second, a third. They moved in a file, long, low hulls, gun barrels like lances pointing into the mist. On the roofs, the crew's black berets bobbed. "Hold," Abrams said on the radio, voice taut. "Not yet. Hold the third into range. Now." Doyle didn't think. He fired. The recoil slammed him back into his seat. Gun smoke rolled into the compartment, metallic and hot. The round sped through the veil of fog, hunting for what months of training had taught him, the thin spot. The third Panther lurched as if someone had punched it in the ribs. Fire flared along its left side, then black smoke poured out like a steam locomotive stack. "Hit!" Kramer shouted, already cradling another round in his arms. "Load!" Back half a step. Hayes yanked the lever. The Sherman tucked another few feet behind the stone fence. The fourth Panther began to traverse its turret, the gun swinging toward the flash that had just betrayed them. "Don't stand still!" Abrams barked, not at anyone in particular, but into the whole atmosphere. "Shoot and move!" Doyle fired again. The shell struck the sloped glacis plate, sparking, and skipped skyward like a stone skimming water. "Damn it!" Kramer hissed. "Too thick up front." "Wait for it to swing. More. Now!" Doyle fired. This time it went up in flames. On the radio, voices tangled. "Hit the flank! M10 firing! Smoke column at 12 o'clock! Damn! It's got me sighted!" A Panther's answering blast jolted the earth. On the right, a Sherman's engine deck shot skyward, then fire engulfed it. A radio net went dead. Everyone heard the cut-off scream, a sound no one ever forgets. "Hold position," Abrams growled through clenched teeth. "Don't waste yourselves on revenge. Fight in pairs. Left wing hold, right wing advance." Just like that, Doyle drew in a deep breath. He fired a third shot. The next Panther took the hit. White smoke puffed, then turned black. On its roof, a figure tried to heave the hatch open before disappearing into flame. "Move!" Hayes roared, not waiting for orders. An explosion shredded the stone fence where they'd been seconds earlier. One more heartbeat in place, and the crew would have been roasting in their own hull. "C1, you still there?" the radio called. "C1 here," Doyle answered, keeping his voice as steady as he could. "Third, fourth, fifth, turned into fireworks. A rough chuckle came from another channel, Abram's voice. Shut your mouths, boys. Don't go bragging too soon. Midday slipped by unnoticed. A rain of shells rattled against stone fences like flies on meat. By afternoon, clouds thickened, winds shifted, and the stink of burning fuel drifted south, mixing with wet earth and scorched grass. Radio traffic steadied. The artillery spoke in clipped, calm phrases again. Fire, mission. Shift target, 300 left. Repeat every 10 seconds. Behind the line, General Wood stood beside a jeep, binoculars pressed to his eyes. He didn't cheer, didn't slap shoulders. He just spoke one sentence, quiet enough for his aide to hear. They remembered the lesson. The aide glanced at the map and said softly, "But the Germans haven't committed everything." "That other brigade is still in reserve." Wood folded his binoculars. "I know." Toward evening, as fog crept back in, Abrams visited Company C's sector. He stood half out of the lead Sherman's turret, his gloves blackened with soot. "Nice work," he told Doyle. 3 kills in half an hour. Keep your pace steady. Don't let success blind you." Doyle nodded, careful not to look at the Sherman burning not far away. Abrams turned to Hayes. "Driver, you've got a survivor's touch." "Don't change." "Yes, sir," Hayes answered with a faint grin. Abrams dropped back to the ground. "Tonight, we shift positions. Let the Wildcats think we're still sitting here. Tomorrow morning, if the fog holds, we'll give them lesson number 2. "What lesson is that, sir?" Kramer called after him, still clinging to his wisecracks to keep his nerves taut. Abrams paused, turned his head, eyes flashing with the spark of a man who'd just found a way around brute strength. "The lesson that a 75mm box of iron, if it picks its angle and its distance, can punch through a cat's hide." He walked off, vanishing into the thickening haze of smoke and fog. Overhead, a slit of light broke through the clouds, then closed. Lorraine's night sank down, not peaceful, but the kind of silence that comes with holding your breath before the next blow. Inside the hull, Doyle pressed his forehead into his palm, letting the cool bone soothe the burn in his eyes. He thought of Boston, of the real Lucy, of the corner bakery with the smell of hot butter every morning. Then he opened his eyes, staring into the pitch black beyond the sight. "Tomorrow," he whispered, not sure to whom, "tomorrow we'll still be here." "Yeah," Kramer answered, wrapping the ammo box lid like a drum beat to seal the promise. "And tomorrow they'll still call us tin cans." "Let 'em. Tin cans have teeth somewhere to the north." A Panther coughed like a lifelong smoker and died out. Another engine fired to replace it. The machine of war never truly slept. But inside their little Sherman, 3 men listened to their own heartbeats and the warming hum of steel. And between those beats lay a fragile thread of hope. That skill, brotherhood, and a little luck might be enough to see them through tomorrow. September 19th, 1944. Dawn. Lorraine's fog hung thick, a milky curtain draped before the sun. The flatlands around Arracourt lay in eerie silence, broken only by the caw of a stray crow and the drip of dew from dead branches. But the silence was only a shell, hiding the storm of steel about to break. Inside his Sherman, Doyle blinked awake from a fitful sleep. His neck ached from resting it against cold steel all night. From the driver's seat came Hayes's low voice. "Wake up, Doyle." The fog's thick as milk again this morning. I'll bet those wildcats come prowling. Kramer, the loader, pulled an AP shell from its crate and set it carefully along the gun breech as though handling a live egg. He gave a dry chuckle. The thicker the fog, the better. The Krauts can't see a damn thing. They'll charge like bulls. And us? We know where they are, and we'll shoot first. The radio snapped alive with Abrams' sharp voice. "Stand ready." Recon reports a large formation advancing on Arracourt. Brigade 113, Panthers, a lot of them, hold silence, wait for orders. No one answered. Every man just gripped tighter, as if the very word Panther had thickened the air. On the other side, in the German column, Lieutenant Helmut Krüger, commander of a Panther company, tightened his binoculars and squinted into the haze. Ahead stretched open farmland, a dirt road leading straight toward Arracourt. He knew the Americans were out there somewhere, but where? His crew itched with impatience. "Herr Leutnant, let's just push on into the village. They've only got Shermans with 75s. They don't stand a chance against Panthers." Krüger snapped. "Shut your mouths. Shermans are weak, but the Americans are clever. Don't underestimate them. We keep formation and crush them before they can call the Air Force." He glanced skyward. The heavy fog covered everything. At least this time, no P-47s to harass them. He raised his hand. "Forward!" Tracks screeched through the mud. More than 40 Panthers surged out of the fog like iron beasts charging from a cage. Inside Doyle's Sherman, the sight shuddered. Shapes loomed from the mist. 1, 2, then a long line. Panther barrels gleamed like silver lances in the fog. Hayes whispered, "Lord Almighty, they're thick as ants." Abrams on the radio, "Hold, let them come in range, steady." Doyle's heart hammered. The moment felt like the whole world holding its breath. Then Abrams' voice broke it. "Fire! Boom!" Shermans opened up from hedges, ditches, stone fences. Gun flashes lit the fog, shells hammering into Panther flanks. One Panther erupted in flame, its turret flipping off like the lid of a box. Krüger shouted, "Ambush! Swing turrets! Return fire!" The Panthers blasted back. One Sherman ahead of Doyle took a direct hit, exploding, the ammo cooking off into a torch that consumed the crew. Doyle clenched his jaw and squeezed the trigger. His shot slammed into another Panther's side. Fire and smoke engulfed it. "Hit! Reload!" Kramer bellowed, jamming another shell home. Hayes stomped the throttle, backing into a fence line as a German 75 tore through the ground they'd just left. Across the field, chaos reigned. Shermans fired, pulled back, then darted forward again. Panthers, blinded by fog, loosed wild shots, many of them wasted. But some struck home. One Sherman after another went up, crews screaming inside the fire. A platoon of M10s rolled in from the tree line, firing at barely 150 yards. Their AP rounds punched straight through Panther hulls, dropping 7 in minutes. But the cost was brutal. 3 of the 4 M10s were blown apart in the counterfire, only one limping away. American artillery began to pound the German formation. 105S burst overhead, showering mud, steel and wreckage into the choking haze. Inside Krüger's tank, the noise was deafening. He shouted into the radio, "Hold formation! Stay steady." It was useless. Panthers burned. Flames drove crews out, only to be cut down by American machine guns. The formation dissolved into disorder. Krüger gritted his teeth and fired back, his round blowing apart a Sherman hidden behind a fence. But he knew the battle was slipping away. Doyle swung left. A Panther was edging for a flank. He fired. The shell ricocheted skyward. The Panther swung its gun on them. "Oh, God!" Hayes gasped. At that instant, an American 57mm anti-tank gun on the field's edge barked. The small round hit perfectly on the Panther's side, and it went up in a fireball. Doyle let out a shuddering breath, cold sweat dripping down his neck. By noon, the fight was at its height. Smoke, fire, and concussion turned Arracourt into a vision of hell. The ground was chewed raw by treads and shell holes. The screams of men, the tearing of steel, the roar of engines blended into one relentless, haunting din. As the sun climbed higher, the fog began to lift. Across the battlefield lay more than 50 blackened Panthers, turrets flung across the fields. The Shermans had taken heavy losses too, but the line still held. Abrams's voice came over the net, hoarse but steady. "They've lost half a brigade, and we're still standing. Arracourt is ours, inside Doyle's Sherman." The three men sat drained, surrounded by smoke, burnt oil, and the sickening stench of charred flesh. Hayes let out a long breath. Hell, but it's their hell. Through his sight, Doyle watched one crippled Panther backing slowly away, hull belching smoke, guns sagging toward the mud. He whispered, "They'll be back. And so will we." September 19th closed with Arracourt a graveyard of steel and fire. But for the Americans, it was the face of victory. September 21st, 1944. After 3 days of relentless fighting, the Arracourt battlefield was carpeted with smoke and wrecked armour. Burned-out Panthers lay sprawled across field edges, Shermans gutted into blackened hulks, gun barrels bent skyward. The air was choking, heavy with the stench of oil smoke and burned flesh. But that morning, the weather changed. The Lorraine fog began to lift. A thin grey ceiling broke apart, revealing rare patches of blue sky, and with it came hell from above. At the front, Doyle squinted upward. At first, just a faint whine, like bees in the distance. Then louder, until the whole Sherman shook. He craned his neck and saw the sky filled with silver specks, P-47 Thunderbolts of the 405th Squadron, 19th Tactical Air Command. "Dear God, the guardian angels are here," Kramer breathed, his hands still blackened with grease and powder. For the German tank crews, it was a nightmare. On the radios, officers screamed themselves hoarse. "Get to the woods! Scatter now! Don't bunch up! Too late." The Panther column was still on open ground, no cover. The P-47s rolled in, rockets streaking white trails through the sky. Wham! A rocket slammed into the command tank's roof, turret flying off like a kicked can. A moment later, a 500-pound bomb came down, shaking the earth. Fire roared skyward in pillars tens of feet high. Inside Doyle's Sherman, the crew stared, hardly believing their eyes. In minutes, an entire German company was shattered under the airstrike. "Like God throwing hammers," Hayes muttered. But Doyle knew better. This wasn't divine intervention. It was the price the Germans paid for relying too much on fog, with no plan for when the skies cleared. Elsewhere above Lorraine, Captain Charles Carpenter, Rosie the Rocketer, piloted his tiny Piper L4 low over the treetops. Strapped under each wing strut were bazooka tubes. Below him, a group of Panthers tried to withdraw. Carpenter dove. Rockets whooshed out, two slamming into a Panther's side. The tank shuddered, fire bursting upward. Germans scrambled out in panic, only to be cut down by nearby American infantry. Carpenter circled back, loosing another salvo. 2 more Panthers went up in flames. Word spread like wildfire through the American lines. Some crazy pilot in a paper airplane just killed Panthers. Morale soared. By noon, Arracourt was a cauldron. P-47s roared down in waves, blasting supply columns, half-tracks, even towed artillery. With the fog gone, the Germans were naked targets in the open. Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, received frantic reports. Brigade 113 has lost more than half its strength. Brigade 111 is shattered. Supplies aren't getting through. American air is tearing up our entire rear. He bowed his head. The counter-attack the Führer had demanded was collapsing. That afternoon, Abrams stood atop his Sherman turret, binoculars pressed to his eyes, watching white contrails slash the blue. In the distance, Panthers burned like giant torches. He gave a single nod and said quietly, "The sky is ours again." On the radio, General Wood's order came short and clear. "The door is open. Prepare for the counterblow. September 22nd, 1944. A blood-red dawn spread across the Arracourt fields. Wrecks still smoked, their twisted hulks littering the ground. Yet despite the losses, the Germans hurled in more tanks. Fresh Panthers rolled down from the north, determined to smash the American line once and for all. Inside Doyle's Sherman, the radio crackled. "They're coming head-on from 12 o'clock. Hold positions. Reserve Shermans are on the way." Hayes clenched the controls, his voice taut. "This time they've gone mad." Kramer gave a dry laugh, slapping the ammo box shut. "Mad makes them easier to kill. Load it all up. Today's going to be a long one." On the forward line, American infantry braced the blow. Outgunned and outnumbered, they fought to hold ground, every minute bought with blood. Jeeps with mounted machine guns, recon patrols with nothing heavier than rifles, all fought a desperate delaying action, knowing they were bait, buying time for the Shermans and M10s to set the trap. German Panthers crushed fences and tore across fields. Suddenly, American artillery erupted. Dozens of 105s and 105s thundered, laying a wall of fire. Out of the earthworks, Shermans surged up, guns blazing. AP rounds punched into Panther flanks. From the wings, M10s swept in, hammering round after round. Abrams led the charge. Driving his own Sherman straight into the German flank, he roared over the radio. 37th, follow me. Break their left." Companies C and B stormed forward together. Doyle blasted a Panther as it swung its turret, then rumbled past smoking wrecks. Hayes shoved the throttle, the engine roaring as they hooked into the enemy's side. Kramer jammed round after round into the breach. They tore into the German flank, hitting the thin armour where it hurt most. Explosions ripped across the field. 1, 2, 3 Panthers went up. The German formation faltered. Panzerwaffe crews abandoned their machines, running through fire and gunfire. Kruger, one of the few German officers left, shouted desperately, "Wheel around! Hold the line!" But it was useless. Panthers dropped one after another under the pounding. The Shermans, backed by artillery and air, overran them with speed and relentless fire. The battlefield became a furnace. By midday, the German assault had collapsed completely. American troops surged forward, smashing Brigade 113. Within hours, the unit was annihilated. Abrams stood on his turret, looking out over a battlefield choked with smoke. He knew this was the turning point. The Germans had lost 2 brigades in just a few days. The radio carried General Wood's voice. "Victory. Hold your lines. Sweep the stragglers. Today, the field is ours, inside the Sherman." Doyle slumped back in his seat, gasping for breath. Hayes let go of the controls, his hands trembling. Kramer fished a cigarette from his helmet and lit it off a burning wreck still smouldering nearby. "It's over," Kramer muttered, "at least for today." Through his periscope, Doyle gazed out at the fields. Dozens of Panthers lay charred black, their guns pointing helplessly skyward. He whispered, "Thick armour can't save you when your spirit breaks." And in that moment, they all understood victory was close. September 29th, 1944. The Lorraine battlefield had endured more than 10 days of fire and steel. The Arracourt fields, once corn and barley, were now graveyards of burned armour. Panther turrets lay scattered like lumps of coal. Sherman wrecks lay mixed among them, smoke still rising in thin threads. The silence was eerie, broken only by crows and the wind whistling through shattered farmhouses. Along the American line, men of the 4th Armoured Division worked in silence. They dragged the bodies of their friends from blackened hulls, burying them under mounds marked with helmets or rough boards. Doyle sat slumped against the side of Lucy, helmet in his lap, staring blankly at the fields. Kramer, still smelling of powder and oil, gently placed a cigarette in his hand. "Smoke it. We made it through. That's miracle enough," Hayes, bent over the damaged track, muttered as he worked. Lucy made it too. That's all that matters. Doyle took a long drag. The smoke burned, but it was warm. He looked at the weary figures around him, men laughing weakly, telling half-shaken, half-proud stories of moments when they should have died. In that instant, Doyle understood. They weren't fighting for grand strategy, but for one another, for the buddy at their side, for the people waiting across the ocean. At the field headquarters, General John S. Wood sat over his report to Allied Command. He crossed out and rewrote lines. Casualty numbers were hard to swallow. At last he settled on plain words. In 10 days of fighting, the 4th Armoured Division destroyed or disabled 285 German tanks and armoured vehicles. We lost 25 Shermans, 7 anti-tank guns, and hundreds of men. But the line held, and Patton still advances. He set down his pen, lit a cigarette, and exhaled heavily. It was the division's greatest victory, yet it came with wounds that would never heal. He glanced at Crichton Abrams, just returned from the line, his uniform streaked with grime, his face hollow, but his eyes still sharp. "Abrams," Wood said, "you've done what most thought impossible." "You and your tin cans buried 2 whole Panther brigades," Abrams only shrugged. "We just did what we were trained to do. The difference is my crews believed in each other. The Germans didn't." Across the lines, at 5th Panzer Army headquarters, General Hasso von Manteuffel sat hollow-eyed in his field tent. Reports poured in, Brigades 111 and 113 shattered, the 11th Panzer Division down to less than half its tanks. A staff officer whispered, "Sir, we have nothing left to throw in. The men are spent, the fuel is gone. We must withdraw." Manteuffel nodded, voice bitter. "Withdraw. But the Führer won't forgive us." He was right. In Berlin, Hitler raged when he heard of the defeat. In conference, he slammed the table, shouting, "Cowards! With new Panthers, with superior guns, and you let those clowns in worn-out Shermans crush you. Unacceptable." He blamed everyone, General Blaskowitz of Army Group G, Manteuffel, even junior officers for lacking spirit. And, as always, he vented his fury with dismissals. Blaskowitz was sacked, replaced with a more loyal commander. The irony was cruel. Despite losing hundreds of tanks and 2 brigades, German High Command consoled itself that they had stopped Patton since the US Third Army did not surge into Germany right after Arracourt. In truth, Patton's halt had nothing to do with German resistance. His fuel had been diverted to Montgomery's Drive in the north. The Germans misread the pause as their own victory, clinging to a hollow illusion. On the last night of September, at the American bivouac, Doyle sat with Kramer and Hayes around a small fire. They said nothing, watching the flames flicker, listening to distant, scattered artillery. Abrams passed by, pausing to lay a hand on Lucy's turret. "You fought like tigers," he said quietly. "Tomorrow we march again. But don't forget the men who stayed behind here. They're the reason we're still standing." Doyle looked up and saw in Abrams's eyes not only resolve, but the quiet sorrow of a soldier long accustomed to loss. The Battle of Arracourt closed as a resounding American victory. It would never be as famous as Stalingrad or Kursk, just another clash on the Western Front. But for those who survived, Arracourt was unforgettable, proof that wars are decided not just by weapons, but by men. And here, at Arracourt, Crichton Abrams' name began to rise, on its way to becoming legend in the history of America's armoured forces. Across the Lorraine fields, burned-out hulks lay silent. They bore witness to a bitter irony. The Germans thought they had won, but in truth, Arracourt marked the beginning of the end for the Wehrmacht's hopes of counterattack in the West.